Please join me once again in welcoming Larry Rinder. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, Max. Thank you.
I know that with someone of your achievements, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the past. I'd love to delve into the present and start with the very present, ask if this is your first visit to our fair city.
It is my first visit to Indianapolis, and I hardly knew what to expect. I knew it would probably be autumn here, and it is, and that's great. I was very surprised when I walked around the corner from my hotel and saw that giant monument, which is really very large.
Yes,
so you have
is.
that.
Yeah.
That's about all I've seen so far,
Right.
aside from this marvelous museum.
Yeah. Well, that's where we'll keep it. You'll see Monument Circle and then this museum, and then you're heading off again, I
That's
know.
it.
But we had a meeting earlier today of the Convention and Visitors Association to talk about all the extraordinary things in our city. And I think one of the many features of what we're looking to pull off this coming spring is something you did tour with Lisa on a golf cart.
That's right,
New
in the
approach.
rain, yeah.
Yeah, of the Art and Nature Park. And we were talking earlier about art parks around the country. So give us your unvarnished assessment of what we're trying to pull off here.
Well, I loved it. I think it's just a beautiful project. I'm competing with my love of art, a close second, possibly even more than my love of art, is my love of nature and natural things and wildernesses and things of that kind. So combining them in this way is really, it's marvelous for me to see. And I think that the way you're doing it is terrific on many levels. I think it's very sensitive to the environment, which interestingly isn't exactly a pristine environment. It's not truly natural in any respect. It's sort of a recovering site of former agriculture and mining and so on. But nevertheless, it's been softened by growth and trees and so on, and I think that the work you're doing there is great. My favorite sculpture park in the world is a little-known place out in Brittany called Kerguenek, the Domaine de Kerguenek, which is on the grounds of I think, a 17th century chateau. And there's a park probably about the size of this one, maybe somewhat larger, where works of art have been sited in the landscape, some permanently and some temporary. And this project recalls that one to me, and I think has the potential into evolving into being that kind of place that is both wonderful to be in as a site of nature, but also a place where art can perform its function as a vehicle for surprise and delight, which it often can't do quite so well in museums, I hate to say, because the expectation of surprise, which the museum sets up so wonderfully, it's sort of the mise en scène for surprise, kind of takes some of the surprise out, actually. So to be able to work in a setting like this and insert things like that Teamekapa boat that you've been building out there, I think will have just the right impact on your visitors, and I like it. And I also like the idea that you've raised all the money for it for now and forever. Although maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe he's going to come to you later and ask you for more money. But you've raised a lot of money, which is great. I've always felt that the perfect sort of art institutional situation would be an enterprise that had an endowment of about $20 million, which could sort of run on its own steam in perpetuity without the headache of thinking about further fundraising, and that's more or less what you've got.
Well, fundraising started long before I got here, but we're excited to see it within spitting distance. Let me ask you about another outdoor project, which was in New York for the Whitney Biennial, and quite a different tangle of woodlands and wetlands, Central Park. You recall some of the antics that we were up to with the various incentive audiences near the park and their concerns about really breaking a tradition, which was until that time Central Park had not had contemporary art since the 1870s.
Right.
So can you reflect a little bit about that experience as another kind of park?
Right. Well, I have a very wonderful mental capacity, which is that I repress every negative experience that has happened to me. So I can only recall the positive outcome and the fact that we were, in fact, the progenitors of the first exhibition of contemporary art in the park, which now has become quite expected and natural. I actually don't recall much, if any, resistance. But you probably kept that from me. It's true. You're great at that. Yeah. I do remember standing in the wintry setting of the sort of that elm, the marvelous elm walk with Mayor Bloomberg at the dedication of the Roxy Payne tree, and it was the one and only time I met Mayor Bloomberg, and he was there to dedicate a tree made of aluminum, and I thought, you're a good mayor, keep it going.
Well, it's true, and it did open an avenue for activity in a place that had until that time been considered sacred ground, which was really not to be molested. It was Olmsted zone, and the only thing you could do was an occasional concert in the park. Yeah, that was over the next day. If
I'm not mistaken, I think that Bloomberg himself may have contributed funds specifically to the park project.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that that time also, we were recovering from a different administration, and with Mayor Giuliani, and we were going through a new episode, a new chapter of real interest in supporting the arts, and it was an exciting opportunity, and one that I think for all of us in the world of museums, we are often beholden to the character of a city by virtue of how its leadership looks at culture. So let's back up much farther and back up to your origins as a curator, starting with your experiences at the Museum of Modern Art and the Walker. Give us some sense of what got you into this.
Right. Well, the whole art thing for me has been kind of an accident. I had intended to become an attorney. That was my ambition, and but my father was dead set against it and wanted me to study poetry in Greenwich Village. And so we compromised, and I went to art school. That was sort of the compromise. He did not believe in higher education at all, but if I was going to be educated, I might as well be educated as an artist. So I graduated without any skills. I mean, because I really wasn't an artist, and there was really nothing I could do. I couldn't even get a job as a waiter when I got out of college, because I didn't know how to wait tables.
When did you work at Studio 54? Then?
Oh, Max, now you're going too deep.
Oh, okay. Idle curiosity.
Yes, it's true. I was a busboy at Studio 54 for a brief period in around 1980, but I wasn't very good at it, even at that. So there was no future for me in cleaning tables. But, you know, through that magical thing called networking, I ended up in the office of Alexander Anderson, who was a great, and still is a great New York city editor, the classic sort at that time. She was the editor of Arts and Antiques magazine, and she was the mother of one of my classmates at Reed. And she had 5 minutes to see me, and she said, you know, I'm busy, what do you want? What do you want to do with your life? And I said, I'd love to work in a museum someday, you know, and just then the phone rang, and it was Philip Yenowin, who was the director of education at MoMA. And she said, oh, Philip, darling, I have the most marvelous young man here. You know, you must give him a job. And that was it. I mean, that was how it happened. Anyway, I worked with Philip for 3 years, and Philip was the most marvelous mentor a person entering the museum field could possibly have, because he was generous and wise and understood in a really visceral and I would say almost spiritual way, if I was a spiritual person, the way that museums can matter in society. And he was an odd sort to be working at MoMA, frankly, which sort of had a different take on museums' role in society, especially at that time. But we were down at the end of our dark corridor, you know, having great visions about what, in fact, a museum could do. And I was hired to go out into the public school system of New York City and talk to kids, junior high school students and high school students, about art. And I would have 40 minutes in the classroom of, you know, PS 46 in Staten Island one day and PS 77 in the South Bronx the next day. 40 minutes to talk to kids who maybe had never seen a painting before in their lives and to convey to them something about why this might matter. And that was the greatest education I could have possibly had in understanding the relationship of art to society or to audiences and publics. And I learned much more from them than, you know, I brought to them, I'm sure, and more from them than I learned in 4 years of undergraduate education and 2 years of graduate education. So that was great, and then from there I ended up at the Walker Art Center. It was my first job in the curatorial aspect of museum work. And I was hired by one of the great figures in the history of modern American museum practice, Martin Friedman, who you know, was also another great mentor to me. I remember I wrote my first essay for him about something or other, and it came back with a big red X across it. And I thought, well, that's a certain kind of editing, you know. But what he was telling me was not that I got the punctuation wrong, but that I was too much in it. It was all about me. And I had to take a step back and realize that I was part of a larger institution, adopt the museum's voice and work sort of with the thing. And that was helpful, and I'm glad he did it early on and you know, destroyed my ego quickly with one stroke of the pen, and I moved on from there.
Well, you moved on from there, but you've had so many peaks and successes, and I make sure we use the epithet that Newsweek assigned to you some years ago. This is the man who decides what art is, no pressure. And I was hoping you'd give us some context on that assertion, not so much about why you're that man, but how you go about deciding what art deserves your attention and the attention of the public.
Well, needless to say, that comment was the death knell of my career in New York City. And I think it came pretty early on, so I spent sort of 3 years in a slow mortifaction. But you know, I think the reason that that comment was made was that my approach to curating is one where I do my best not to depend on the opinions of others. And this might seem like a common sense approach in a way. After all, art is subjective. But the fact is that so much of the art world relies on people scurrying around from one opinion source to another, and it's very interesting. You'd think the whole thing would just sort of collapse in on itself if everyone is sort of worried about what everyone else thinks. At some point, you know, they'd realize that no one actually does think anything, and but that has not happened yet. So I have just felt, and I don't know where this, you know, comes from. It's an innate stubbornness, or maybe Martin actually didn't kill my ego sufficiently. But I do think that not that I have the answer to what art is, but that it's all I have as a professional is my perception. That is what I have to rely on. And if I do rely on it, not that I'll be right in the sense that others are wrong, but the work that I do will be effective and meaningful and will reach audiences because it has my passion behind it. And you know, that's all I have. That is my integrity. And so when I was doing work on shows like the Biennial, I went out and I actually looked at art. You know, that shouldn't sound so odd, but it is, in fact.
Well, it is, because the time-tested system of the Biennial certainly was to ask people for references, artists, gallerists, collectors, and then play a game of telephone, a very elaborate one. But you were intrepid in thinking otherwise, and you often brought forward talent that had been unrecognized, and you also made decisions and continue to make decisions that don't strike a chord with the marketplace. Because the marketplace is looking, of course, for a solution of their own. But I remember when Rosalie Tompkins we brought to me and said, this is someone I think deserves our attention at the Whitney. Tell us a bit about that voyage of discovery of her work.
Rosalie Tompkins, who was an African-American quilt maker, lived in Richmond, California, died about 4 years ago, was unknown to me and virtually everyone else in the world until I went to an exhibition at the Richmond Art Center, a community art center in Richmond, and saw a show on black and white African-American quilts that was organized by a fellow named Eli Leon. And in that show, there was, you know, a variety of quilts, and there were two that just jumped out at me as being utterly remarkable and original and successful as art, whatever that is. And I noticed they were by the same person, this Rosalie Tompkins. So I called this person, the curator, Eli Leon, who I hadn't known, and I said, so who is Rosalie Tompkins? And he said, oh, you like what she does in black and white, you should see what she does with color, you know. Come over to my place. So I went over to his house, which was a little shack in East Oakland, and inside this house he has the most extraordinary collection of African-American quilts. And this house is like a tinderbox. It could, like, you know, and there's a faint smell of, you know, natural gas in the air, and, you know, And it would be as if you had the original and only recording of all the great bebop jazz tunes recorded from 1950 to the present in one location that was in danger of blowing up. That's what, this Eli Leon's house is like. And so the Rosalie Tompkins piece of this was a very small sliver of his collection, but he brought these things out, and the house was so small he had to hang the quilts out the front window over the garage door, and so people going by in their cars would slow down and sort of call out their, their particular connoisseurship, points about the works. And anyway, I thought this woman is a genius, and because the work had such an original and fresh approach to composition and color and material and all those things that have been the mainstay of art for a very long time. So I asked to meet her, and he said, well, she won't meet you. She's an anonymous person. She doesn't care about the art world. She makes these things. It's a very private practice. Anyway, to make a long story short, she did agree to meet me. I met her a couple times. Eli and I were the only two people, aside from her family, and the great scholar of African art from Yale, Robert Ferris Thompson, who ever met Rosalie Tompkins. He came out, he flew out, he wanted to meet her, and I got her to agree to meet Robert Ferris Thompson. She couldn't care less, who he was, but she took my word for it that there was a guy who would be good to meet. And he flew all the way to Oakland, and I called her. I said, Rosie, we're on our way. She said, oh, I've changed my mind. I don't want to meet him. And I told Robert, and I wanted to respect her, whatever she said. I think the artist is like always right. And he said, oh, poppycock, let's go. So we went over there and knocked on her door, and she did love him after all. It's hard not to love Robert Ferris Thompson. So unfortunately she passed away, but we did manage to include some of her work in the biennial and acquired, I think, her greatest piece for the Whitney. And the Berkeley Art Museum just bought an absolutely magnificent work for our permanent collection about a month ago.
Great. One of the shows you did early on at the Whitney was Bitstreams, which was another kind of assault on reason, and in part because the thesis was something is happening in the air, this digital thing, and you didn't want to do an exhibition that was the triumph of technology. In fact, you wanted to go in the opposite direction and look at art practices in ways that certainly touched on technology but otherwise didn't. What kind of experience was that in a prospecting way, specifically in that universe of artists who were tangentially or not involved in things technological?
Right. Well, I had sort of set the stage for that exhibition with a much smaller show that I had done at CCA just prior to coming to the Whitney. So I had already begun to sort of tease out some of these issues, and particularly, as you say, this point that the interesting place to explore was not necessarily the most cutting-edge gizmo, but rather the ways in which digital technology had changed the way we see and think and experience life, and to look at the ways in which that transformation was being expressed in art across the board, in work that might have a digital aspect to it in terms of its medium, but also art that might not. I mean, there might be an oil painting that expressed something that was new to our experience as a result of digital technology. So I think that, in a way, as a result, the exhibition, which I like a lot, and I look back at many of the artists and I think, well, that they were great, and I'm glad they were in the show. But I think the show disappointed the sort of true believer technophiles, that they wanted very much a show that was a kind of an in-crowd thing. And I think to this day, there's an unfortunate siloing of sort of the community of digerati. There's kind of a parallel universe of digital practice that's sort of like the parallel universe of ceramics practice or studio glass practice, that there's nothing wrong with it per se, but in its isolation it develops in a way that I think is not as ideally fertile as it might be if it was more open to discourse across disciplines. And there is, I think, a real resistance in that community to sort of, sharing the goods or the candy, whatever. I mean, I didn't get a lot of hostility about that, but there was some incomprehension, more, and I think from both sides. And the more traditionally minded people were wary about, the incursion of this new medium to begin with. So, I mean, hopefully it brought together more thought than it drove apart, and I do think that some of the artists who we had in that show, people like Jeremy Blake and Robert Lazzarini, who really had their major introduction to New York in that show, both of whom have gone on to, I think, great careers. All of that was quite satisfying.
Well, and of course it also laid bare some truths which were not self-evident. I remember being in April Gornick's studio before that exhibition, and she flipped open a MacBook and said, see, I'm drawing preparatory sketches for my very classical landscapes.
Yeah.
And I had no idea about it until the premise of the show was coming. So there are a lot of truths that I think it also were uncomfortable truths for artists who were working in a more traditional way.
Right. And I'm sure you read the thing about David Hockney's iPhone app paintings that was in the New York Review of Books recently. Fascinating.
We sort of ended our time together at the Whitney with a major exhibition which was born in tragedy in 9/11. And after 9/11, I remember we sat down with all of us, curators and director, and talked about what response there might, if any, be to that event. And ultimately, we sent a show to Europe thinking, well, we can teach the world to sing, like that old Coca-Cola commercial about how great America is. But in the end, what we did was a show called The American Effect. And before we move on to more recent times, tell us about that experience and what that was about.
Well, that show did grow out of this conversation that you reference, which was probably 2 or 3 months after September 11th, in my recollection, and a challenge sort of thrown down by Leonard Lauder, if I call correctly, to say, we're the Museum of American Art, this tragedy has occurred, how do we respond to it? And I think that I had been thinking sort of in this direction prior to that challenge, but the incidents of September 11th and Leonard's challenge and all of that made me think that this is really something that has to happen. So the basic premise of the show being to look at non-American perspectives on the United States from 1990 to the present, which was a switching of the paradigm for the Whitney, which I don't think had ever done a show of non-American art before. So it was very symbolic in a sense, and in order to embody the idea of the show itself of sort of an opening to dissent possibly, or certainly to other ideas, it was important that it happened at the Whitney. It wouldn't have been as meaningful as if it had happened at the Met or the Modern. So that sort of turning inside out and saying, okay, we've stared into our own navel now for long enough. Let's open ourselves to the outside world. So that was great. Of course, once I proposed it and you said, fine, go ahead and do it, I thought, what the hell have I gone and proposed? But you really called my bluff on that. But it was an absolutely fascinating research project. I traveled to 25 countries all over the world, including Cuba and Colombia and Vietnam and Russia, all friends and foes alike. And there's nothing like going into a country to discover something about that society through the pathway of art and through the sort of under the wing of artists. So I would immediately be taken into people's confidence in this really remarkable way and sort of taken to the heart of something that was a very often difficult and complex thing to unpack, but art has that remarkable quality of resonating in ways that are beyond words. And so I think that I had a much more privileged access than a journalist would have had or a politician to really understanding the layered experience that people had of America that included political, economic, cultural, emotional, and psychological resonances. And that aspect of it, that way that art had a unique capacity to express the multivalency of that experience was, it turned out, exactly what was called for in that time. For any of you who were in New York after September 11th, you will recall, or maybe in the whole United States, there was an atmosphere of there were certain things that could not be discussed. It was really kind of a frightening time in relation to free speech, frankly. I mean, you could not be really openly critical of the United States in certain ways. You couldn't say anything that would even slightly suggest that the United States had done anything in the world ever to bring this about, to bring it on itself. so it was a very, one felt how a country could descend into a kind of a state control and a kind of a, I don't want to use a phrase to overstate it, but a kind of a fascistic mindset. I mean, there were American flags everywhere in Manhattan. It was just there's nothing wrong with America, of course, but you don't want to have an American flag hanging from every window. I mean, if you have to be that patriotic, you know there's a certain amount of overcompensation going on. So, but the one place where a kind of truly democratic expression could unfold was in the realm of art, because art has that capacity to contain multiplicities and to contain contradictions. So the museum, I think, at that moment became one of the few spaces in New York that enabled that kind of expression. And I was very, very pleased and happy and proud when the New York Times gave us their entire op-ed page, you know, top to bottom for this show. Didn't ask me or you to write an op-ed piece. What they did was they chose 6 of the artists in the show and asked them to write 150 words about their experience of the United States, along with an image of you know, one of the works in the show, to suggest, and I think, you know, for the same reason that I've been talking about, that the art played a vital role in the museum context, that it was time for the pundits to take a step back and, you know, let art do the work for one moment. And I thought that is just an amazing moment for art in this country, that it occupied that position. Now, and I always throughout that show emphasized that my expertise was as an arbiter or connoisseur, whatever you want to call it, of art, that I was not making a statement about politics. And the show did not have a position about politics. The show was first and foremost about artwork, the best artwork that I found that had the United States as a subject. Nevertheless, I found myself on occasion in positions being invited to serve on panels discussing the events of September 11th. I remember at one point I'm sitting next to the Chief of Police of New York, Ray Kelly, and, you know, somehow I thought, how did a curator get into this position, you know? But I do remember one other thing that Leonard Lauder said at a point sort of closer towards the opening of the exhibition. He used a phrase, he said, "Dissent is the oxygen of democracy." And, you know, so we're going to move forward with this. And I thought that was a true and vital and memorable thing to say. And I was very proud that the Whitney did that show.
Well, you've raised an important issue that the art world is constantly backing up against, and that's the instrumental value of art. And the degree to which some critics protest when exhibitions seem to be painting a kind of construct that artworks have to fit into, and at other times a kind of desire for art's sake as something that's freeing from the kind of trope of an exhibition that's proving something. How liberating is it now at Berkeley to look at what you choose to do as a director as opposed to a curator? What's changed for you in that regard of having to shape something in a particular way? Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question, this idea of instrumentality, and I think, just to start with that you know, the American Effect show, in a way, only became instrumental by default. I mean, it was very sort of consciously in the back of my mind, sort of in the mezzanine of my mind or something. But in order to do that show, I had to sort of almost approach it as an art for art's sake show, in order for it to have the vitality and the meaningfulness and the credibility to perform its democratic instrumentality. That was sort of an after effect of which I was very, you know, aware. But if I had foregrounded that, either in my selections of art or in the way that I framed the show, I think it would have fallen flat. It would have been too large a claim for the work. The art would not have, you know, risen to that. So you sort of had to come at it in a tangential way. But as a director, I think that one can work with those questions of instrumentality somewhat more directly. As a curator, I think it's very, very important to stay as close to the sort of the truth of art, if you will, as you can. As a director, you can have closer to the front of your mind these issues of effect and engagement and understanding of the way that not only a single exhibition, but exhibitions in relationship to each other the relationship of exhibitions to a marketing plan, how all the different pieces of a museum add up to something that does indeed engage a community in a specific way. So, for example, and I hope this addresses your question, we recently opened an exhibition of work by Fernando Botero at the museum. This was something that was underway before I got there. Fernando Botero recently, within the past 2 or 3 years, completed a series of about 84 paintings on the theme of Abu Ghraib. These were paintings and drawings that he did, not based on the photographs, but each of the works draws on specific testimony of people who were tortured or the torturers themselves, and represents this very sad chapter in our history. He gave 56 of these works to the museum, so we now have these as part of our permanent collection and have put them on view in a special exhibition. So when I was sort of thinking about the schedule and what does one do, how can one sort of think about the institutional affect and effect with this sort of at the core of the program for the fall. And although I think those works are more multi-layered and subtle and perplexing than one might actually think at first, they are undoubtedly, in their overt qualities, very direct and non-subtle in the way that I think the American Effect was, because American Effect represented a range of opinions, and the Botero show is consistently accusatory in a sense. So my opportunity there was to see what else can be in the museum at the same time that brings some level of balance to that. And the show that we ultimately decided to do was a mid-career survey of the work of Ari Markopoulos, who was one of the artists we included in the 2002 biennial, whose work would not immediately occur to one as a tonic or solvent to the Botero, but I think it is, in the sense that it is work that embraces life, and a life of liberty, frankly, and the liberty to make bad choices as well as good choices, but let's just call it, liberty, teenage joie de vivre and so on. So it wasn't, simply a matter of having a show or artwork in the museum that took an opposing view to Botero. It was really more one of finding work that would, in a way, work with the Botero to say, if not this, then what? What is the spirit of life that what happened at Abu Ghraib was denying?
Well, it raises for me a question about the intentionality of your museum in the Bay Area, and there's an ecology in every city around that. So you have SF MoMA, which is across the water, and how do you, as a director now, cope with the obligation to think institutionally to a degree you haven't, apart from at CCA, which was a different stage? And how does SF MoMA, for example, factor into that, or the de Young?
Well, the landscape in the Bay Area is basically SF MoMA, which is modern and contemporary, which, with the addition of the Fisher collection now, has got to be regarded as one of the 2 or 3 great museums of modern and contemporary art in the world, probably. The de Young, which is an encyclopedic institution that has not traditionally done much of anything with contemporary, but that is changing with the new Herzog and de Meuron building and the gigantic Richter mural. I mean, there is definitely an engagement with contemporary practice, and a handful of other smaller institutions. We are an encyclopedic museum, which some people are not aware of. They think of us as a modern and contemporary museum exclusively. We were founded by Hans Hofmann, the great modernist painter. We're in this brutalist building, and since our founding in 1963, the museum has focused primarily on modern and contemporary exhibitions. The fact is that our collection goes back to the Renaissance in the West and to about 2000 BC in Asian work. We have a better collection of Ming and Qing dynasty Chinese painting than the Asian Art Museum has. So, and then of course we have this, the tail that wags the dog, so to speak, the Pacific Film Archive, with a collection of 15,000 films and videos, you know, early film, French, you know, seminal films, Soviet film, Georgian film, the biggest collection of Japanese cinema outside of Japan, and so on and so forth. So it's a very broad collection. And I think where we fit in is not so much distinct by virtue of the kind of work that we show or collect precisely, but one of disposition, that the D. Young and SF MoMA are much more driven by earned income, by attendance than we are. SF MoMA is something like 25 to 30% of their annual income is from admissions, I think. I mean, luckily they have a lot of admissions. Ours is about 4 or 5%. Now, I wish we had more. On the other hand, we're not reliant on it, and so we can do things that are not driven by box office, so to speak. The D. Young, both because of the extent to which they depend on admissions, and also sort of the role they've cast themselves in as in a way, a populist institution, is going to do things that are just much like they have a King Tut show now. Our tendency would be to do the things that they'd be not inclined to do. I saw the show that you have here now of Sacred Spain. This is, I think it's a marvelous show, and this is the kind of show that I think we would do that they wouldn't. A show that takes a slice of history, marvelous art, with a very insightful perspective on that art that draws on academic knowledge but isn't academic in its presentation. You know, that approaches the flavor of what we might do. When I arrived at the museum, I thought it would be helpful to have a kind of Joseph Boysian equation that to offer to the staff to sort of say, you know, how we could be what we want to be. So it was excellence plus edge equals energy. So that's, you know, what I encourage the staff to bring to everything that we do, sort of equal or relatively equal parts excellence and edge. We don't want to be, you know, merely excellent without the edge part. Then we'll be, you know, the Frick or the Morgan Library. We don't want to be just edge, because that's, you know, not who we are either. We're part of the greatest public university in the world. We have to have that quality of excellence as well. So it's that balance that I think makes us unique, and is one that I find personally invigorating and fun to discern. It's a unique pulse, but once you begin to look for it, you can see it, you know, but you have to kind of attune your perceptions.
You've also been someone who's published very widely, and you've written in ways that aren't always indexed to the popular demand. They're often meditations, they're essays that make us think differently about contemporary art. How would you say the world of publishing and scholarly recording is changing today, the pressures we face to monetize and create these things? How are you looking at that as a challenge going forward, and what you've just talked about as edge and excellence?
Yeah. Well, I think in general, we have to be very, very mindful and attuned to changes in people's habits of reading, and we're certainly in the middle of a transformation now that I think none of us can really predict where it's going. I will tell you that our revenue from our bookstore is in a precipitous decline, and bookstores all over Berkeley are closing, and it's, you know, the writing is in a way on the wall that something is going on there with books. Nevertheless, we are currently in the midst of or embarking on a number of rather substantial book projects, because I do think that there are certain instances where a book is called for. And just some examples. The Ari Markopoulos show, we did a catalog published by J.R.P. Renier, in part because a major part of Ari Markopoulos' artistic practice is the production of zines and experimental book forms. And so he functioned in this instance as the designer for the catalog, and it was very appropriate to do that. Another instance where it was necessary to do a book, if we were going to do anything, was with the work of Teresa Cha, who is an artist who we own probably 99% of everything she made. She was very much attuned to books as a medium and to the sort of the implicit or the inherent or the psychological meanings or resonances of the book form, of reading letters on a page, is actually the subject of a lot of her work. So we recently published a book with UC Press of her previously unpublished poetry and prose. That was the only way to get that out, or in a way the best way to do it. At the same time, we are re-examining our monthly, actually I think it's bi-monthly newsletter, so-called Art and Film Notes, and wondering whether a lot of the material that is delivered through that medium might not be better delivered through other means, like the website, for example. And we are launching a new website very soon, which will have one component to it, which I'll share with you. This is, I hope we've trademarked it already, so you don't scoop us on this. We're not calling it a blog, we're calling it a blook. So web look, not web blog. So it's a blook. The first, you heard it here first.
That's right. Speaking of reusing old things like websites, I wanted to ask you about the new practice that is the High Line in New York represents, which is recuperating the lost environment, much as you described our industrial past with our Art and Nature Park. What's your take on that in relation to cities that are facing challenges and building new buildings versus rehabilitating space?
I saw the High Line a couple weeks ago on my trip to New York. It was the first time I saw it, and it's fantastic. It's just one of the most marvelous things that has happened in New York since Central Park, probably. It is such an inspiring and beautiful project, and the fact that it is made out of a reused industrial part of the city only adds resonance to it. One could imagine the same thing could have been built by constructing platforms, although it probably would never have occurred to anyone. So the waste of that elevated railroad suggested something to people in a way. And maybe that's really a key here, is the way that these unused things can inspire us. They bring us to a place that we couldn't have gotten if we didn't have the ruins, to bring us there. I think that High Line hopefully will inspire people all over this country to think in new ways about the legacy that we've inherited, which is often, a rather tarnished one, or comes with all sorts of possibly complicated associations historically, or even, chemically, God knows. But to work with it to the extent possible, to be inspired by it, and to build something glorious out of those ruins, I think is exactly the way to go. And Diller and Scofidio, who did that project, are people that and we worked with at the museum, and it's just been so great to see their success, and that, I think, is their greatest achievement.
Well, and it seems to be in step with the times here, although we watch what's happening in other parts of the world, whether it's Abu Dhabi or Hong Kong, where the creation of new megalopolis for art is a different instant. But this is more reminiscent of Germans building ruins in 18th century parks or something. There's a sympathy for the past, which is fascinating and appropriate for a time of constraint.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's one piece of it is sort of doing more with less, of course, but the other piece is just the wisdom of not starting from scratch each and every time. Even if we were flush with money, or even when we are again flush with money, I would hope that we would not lose this ethos of making the most of what we have, and the idea that you have to move forward with a clean slate is a troublesome ideology, and not just because it costs a lot.
I want to ask one more question, and then I'd love it if those in the audience would feel free to follow up with your own questions. But I'm curious, now that you're balancing your curatorial acumen with your administrative duties and your leadership as a director, are you able to make time that you feel you need for the life of mind and for looking at art and visiting studios. How are you managing those?
Yeah. Well, I am, thankfully, in a way because I have sort of attuned myself, for better or worse, I mean, this is my solution, to the pulse of my place. So I don't have as much time as I did when I was a curator to travel all over the world. I'm not going to be going to 25 countries anytime soon. But there is an extremely lively and inspiring arts community in San Francisco. And you know, I often feel if I never went to another place, again, I would be satisfied just with what's going on there, for a number of reasons. One of the most important being that there is an extremely vital and healthy intersection across the disciplines in San Francisco. So the relationship between literature and music and art making is constant and very, very fertile. And I find that to be really inspiring and exciting. And it's something that I think was even missing in New York in the time when I was at the Whitney. I think it had been there earlier. In fact, I think it's one of the things that made New York, New York, if you go back to the 30s and the 40s and all of that, up through the 60s and 70s, actually. I think maybe the last great efflorescence of that attitude was the Soho period of, you know, when Philip Glass and all the artists were in the lofts together. And there wasn't, at least in the artist experience, a separation between creativity in music and literature and dance and art making. It was all part of one project. I think everyone in New York has become so professionalized. There's such a kind of an assembly line attitude now, and the dictates of the market mean that you have to make product, and who's got time to go to a poetry reading? In San Francisco, there is no market for art. There never was. There's no downturn because there was never an up, you know. So, so everyone, you know, everyone's still like, oh, you're doing a poetry reading? Great, I'll come. And I love it.
Yeah. Well, they're lucky to have you, and we're all lucky that you're flourishing. I'm wondering if there are some questions from some assembled here, if anyone has anything for Larry.
We do have a board of directors. They're not what's called a fiduciary board, so they don't have ultimate responsibility for the institution financially. And the reason for that is that we are part of the University of California, and our collection and the building and all of us are owned by the regents of the University of California, which is a system-wide board, in effect. They're the board of trustees for the conglomerate that is UC Berkeley, UCLA. You know, it's a huge enterprise. They are our real board, but they don't have a lot of time for us. And so we have this other board that is, as I say, non-fiduciary, but in every other way looks and acts like a typical board with committees, you know, and engagement on all the levels that a board ought to be engaged. In many museums, the reason people join boards is for the social cachet. We don't offer that, you know, at the Berkeley Art Museum. There is no social cachet to being on our board, for better or worse. So the people that we have are there for other reasons. And that is wonderful. It's really terrific. They're there because they believe in art, they believe in the university, and in the relationship between the two. And there are some just marvelous board people. I was at the museum between '88 and '98 as a curator, and then came back in 2004. So I was gone for about, what was that? How many years is that? I can't do the math, but anyway, 6 years. And most of the trustees, the board members were still, that I knew from before, were still there. Many of them are close friends. They're a terrifically enthusiastic and supportive group of people, and it's just a pleasure to work with them. It's one of the things that makes the job, you know, a pleasure, and it's inspiring. So. Yeah. Well, with the American Effect, I think the only thing I would have done differently probably is to have had a little bit more time to work on it. I put it together in a very, very short period of time. I think those 25 countries were visited in the course of about 6 months or something like that, 6 or 7 months. There was some advantage to doing it that quickly. I mean, one of the things we were trying to do at that show was to put our finger on a kind of a moment in time. I think it was important for New York to have that show, and you know, soon. On the other hand, I wasn't able to travel to any Arab countries. So it, you know, would have. That's one thing I would have done differently. I would have gone to an Arab country. We had Arab artists in the show, artists from Muslim countries, but I didn't travel to any. The post-Obama thing, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that came out of working on the American Effect was my perception that America had come to occupy a kind of an archetypal role globally subsequent to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, that our position as the sole global superpower had become a kind of a psychological condition as well as a military, economic, and cultural one, and one that was had both positive and negative nuances or effects psychologically on people around the world. And while our position has not changed in that we are still the sole global superpower, although China is creeping up on us, I think that Obama's election has changed in a way that I think Clinton's did not. The character of that perception, despite the fact that we are the sole global superpower. I think that there at least was initially a sense that Obama's election in a way was sort of more profound than that, that what Obama signified as a black man being elected president of the United States was more important to the world than the fact that the United States was the sole global superpower. It signaled a kind of a sense of opportunity and possibility and reconciliation, again on a psychological or emotional level, that trumped global superpowerdom. So it's not just the fact that he's a nice liberal guy, because Clinton was too. Clinton's election did not fundamentally change the way that people understand America, I don't think.
I'm conscious of the time, and I want to thank Larry Rinder very much for joining us and helping us get a glimpse into his past and present. And
thank you.
We hope to see you again with the opening of the Art and Nature Park.
I'll be back. I'll be back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.